and welcome to the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy at Brown University. We're pleased to have so many students, faculty, alumni, and other interested citizens joining us virtually this evening. I'm Richard Arenberg, visiting professor of the practice of political science and a senior fellow at the Watson Institute. I'm honored to serve this year as the interim director of the Taubman Center, which is a part of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. The Taubman Center seeks to influence American politics and policy through scholarship, public opinion polling, conferences, workshops, academic research, internships, and a robust series of speakers drawn from experts, the media, academia, think tanks, and public officials. This year, we've been placing special emphasis on the 2020 national elections, and now the birth of a new administration and a new Congress, and the legacy of the outgoing president. Tonight, we present the 15th in our series of events. When we conceived of this event to occur a week before the inauguration of Joe Biden to be the 46th President of the United States, we expected to focus mostly on the early days of the Biden presidency and the prospects for his agenda. Since that time, of course, we've watched the defeated president challenge the result of November's election with false accusations and an attempt to block the transition to a new administration. We've seen the results of the runoff elections in Georgia, shifting the balance in the US Senate, and we've experienced a shocking armed invasion of the US Capitol building itself. As a result, we'll focus first on these events, which provide the political environment in which President Biden will assume office, including a continuing threat of violence before or during the inauguration itself. We're fortunate tonight that we're joined by a very distinguished panel of experts from the Brown University faculty. Let me introduce my colleagues. Jonathan Collins is Assistant Professor of Education at Brown. His research has been published in Political Behavior, the Urban Affairs Review, the Journal of Urban Affairs, and Local Government Studies. Rose McDermott is David and Mariana Fisher University Professor of International Relations and Professor of Political Science at Brown. Professor McDermott is the director of the postdoctoral program at the Watson Institute. Her most recent publication is The Evils of Polygyny, the David Easton Lectures by Rose McDermott. Carrie Nordland is the Associate Director of the Annenberg Institute and served previously as the Associate Director of the Masters of Public Affairs at the Watson Institute. She's held faculty positions at Dickinson College and Lake Forest College in the Department of Political Science. And finally, Wendy Schiller is the Royce Family Professor of Teaching Excellence in Political Science. She's Professor of International and Public Affairs, and she's the chair of Brown's Political Science Department. Most recent of her numerous books, she co-edited Dynamics of American Democracy, Partisan Polarization, Political Competition, and Governmental Performance. We'll hear from each of the panelists and myself for 2 or 3 minutes each for an opening thought, and following that, I'll raise a few questions and open things up for discussion among the panel. At about 8 o'clock, we will welcome questions and comments from the audience. Please type these into the Zoom Q&A box. Please keep your questions and comments brief. Provide your name, and if you're a Brown student or alumni, your graduating class. We'll get to as many of these questions as possible. And now let me turn first to Professor Schiller for any opening remarks she might have to offer.
Well, I will start by saying thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel, and I'm really pleased to be able to have a conversation with my colleagues, and we all have different perspectives, and I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. I'll just say that we are, in my opinion, at a historic moment in time for this democracy. We have seen what is essentially an unprecedented domestic attack on our United States Capitol. And in fact, the members of the House of Representatives and the United States Senate and the Vice President inside the Capitol during this period of time. We've had foreign invasions on the Capitol, certainly in the War of 1812 and the British, but not to this extent. We've had other incidents of domestic insurrection and domestic terrorism, of course, going back obviously many years, but Oklahoma City bombing, of course, in 1995, that terrible tragedy, which was a domestic terrorist act that killed 168 people. So we've had terrible domestic driven acts of violence, but this was an attack on the system itself. And so that has shaken all of our core institutions, to the point where change is possible. Whether it happens is something we can discuss tonight, and that we'll have to track for the next 6 to 9 months, if not 2 years, till our next election. But I will make the argument tonight that as unstable and as frightening things may appear to be right now, certainly defending the electoral outcome, the elections themselves occurred with very little, if any, violence at all, and no fraud, and no misbehavior, nothing. People voted. More people than we've had in 100 years voted. And we saw, again, major turnout in Georgia Senate races. And we basically have held our elections peacefully. It's the interpretation of these elections by the side that lost, led by the president, that has caused this kind of dissension. And now we're going to struggle. We're going to struggle a little bit as a society and in government to get ourselves righted again. And I have confidence and optimism that we will. But the circumstances that we'll talk about tonight are so different. And we'll broach, big tech, corporate America, the sort of changing of the guard in the Republican Party. There's lots of issues to talk about tonight, certainly alongside social movements that try to act for progress and to ensure and protect civil rights, and so social, if you can call them that, movements that try to oppress and deny rights. So we got a lot on the table, but I think what we want to do is sort of try to clear eye, explain what's different about this, and what to be on the lookout, and what to be, frankly, still thankful for in the American democracy.
Okay. Professor Collins.
Well, thank you, Professor Ehrenberg, for having me. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be able to be in conversation with colleagues, and especially to be able to discuss, our democracy. That's one of the most important things about, what we have as a set of institutions, is the ability to have these kinds of open discourses about our system, critique it, to praise it, and evaluate it, and then hopefully come away with generative understandings of ways to move it forward. And so, how do you even conceptualize, what's been happening recently? When we first got the idea for doing this panel, I had a whole list of things that I thought I was going to talk about. And then last week happened. And, then you can just kind of, you throw everything out of the window, and now you're trying to figure out, how do we regroup and what do we even talk about now? And, if, the interesting thing about last week is that it showed us the importance of really doubling down on kind of what's at the core, which is we still have this good old racism problem, and, there are two different ways to kind of look at what happened last week. And, you can look at one perspective is, well, we had, rioters who were you know, driven by misinformation or distrust in a political system that seemed to change. Questions of why is record voter turnout happening? You know, why is this person who I'm supporting not on the right side of this record voter turnout? But then it reaches a new level once we start to infiltrate, you know, government facilities, and really a major American symbol of democracy. You know, it's not just the fact that you enter the walls of the Capitol, it's what the US Capitol represents. You know, this is a sacred space for open deliberative discourse around making policies that are supposed to be based off of what the public wants, what the people want. And this attempt to intrude on that was extremely problematic, not just because of the physical damage that it causes, but it's the metaphoric damage that it causes to our democratic society. And this raises questions of how and why, right? You know, and immediately when race gets injected into the conversation, it's because we know if those rioters had darker skin, this would never happen. We see what happens when people of darker skin attempt to infiltrate government facilities. We see what happens when people of darker skin look to even hold peaceful protests, yet alone violently or aggressively enter these kinds of facilities. And then we see some of the symbols that are branded throughout the government facility rooms during the raid. We see the largest Confederate flag that I have ever seen in my life being waved across the US Capitol. And this is happening in 2021. And so again, it goes back to this fundamental issue. Yes, we have an economic situation that we have to figure out. Yes, we have a public health issue with the pandemic that is raging. Yes, we have to figure out how to restore America's view within the scope of the world. But at the root of it all, America continues to show itself as this nation that continues to struggle with race. And until we really reconcile how we can move forward as a collective, how we can move white supremacy and issues of racial discontention to the side and move forward as a collective, we're going to continue to see events like last week happen. And you know, now we have to have a conversation about what the Biden-Harris administration can do to lead us in a different direction.
Professor McDermott?
Hi, thank you so much for including me in this panel, and I really appreciated the comments of my previous panelists. Like Jonathan, I sort of had a list of things that I was going to talk about with the incoming Biden administration when we were asked to do this, but of course it shifted in light of the events of last week. And right before we opened this up, I started by saying to people how grateful I was that the Joint Chiefs of Staff came out today with a statement saying, we follow the Constitution. You know, we do not support the insurrection that happened last week. And I thought it was remarkable for two reasons. One is it was remarkable that they felt they had to issue it, right? I mean, it was wonderful that they did, but nothing like that's ever happened before. And so the fact that they felt it was necessary tells an interesting story about the extent to which the president expects a certain kind of fealty toward him versus the oath that members of the armed forces take, which is to the Constitution, not the person. And I think that's very important for what separates the United States from, say, a country like Venezuela, where the military can actually be co-opted by the leadership in a way that, because of the professionalization of our military, has thankfully not happened. So you see them basically coming out and saying, we will not follow an unlawful order given by the president. We will follow loyalty to the Constitution. And that's very, very important. The second thing I'll say is really about the 25th Amendment, because it's something that I've thought about and written about extensively for quite some time. And one of the things that's interesting and important about this moment in time is it shows the limitations of that amendment. Structural limitations that are built into it for addressing in a timely fashion what happens when you have a leader who's not physically ill, but really mentally ill in a particular kind of way. And it doesn't have to be, the kind of megalomaniacal narcissism of a Donald Trump. It could be somebody who has dementia like Ronald Reagan, but there are holes in it. And so one of the questions I actually have for Wendy, I'm very curious, is one of the things that struck me about the last few years is how much of our democracy has depended on norms that we all kind of assumed were laws, but they actually aren't.
Yes.
And Biden is a great institutionalist. And so to me, what I would love to see him do, in addition to dealing with our horrible problems around the pandemic and economic inequality and racial injustice, is really how do we turn these norms that we thought we had into actual laws that will create institutions that could constrain a future leader from behaving in the kind of completely unacceptable ways that we've seen Donald Trump do, not just in the last week, but frankly, in the last 4 years. And so how do we think about institutionalizing norms of democracy in a stronger way so that we have better and stronger guardrails going forward? And again, I'll just loop before ending saying the most important of those guardrails is really held, which is the military and the independence of these mechanisms of coercion from being co-opted by the president in favor of his particular preference as opposed to fealty to the Constitution. So I'll stop there.
I do want to come back in a minute to the 25th Amendment and impeachment, talk a little more about that. But Professor Norland?
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Taubman Center, for having me. Thrilled to be here as well with my fellow panelists. As I watched events unfold on Wednesday, there were 3 things sort of a week later that have finally sort of settled in my head. And a few of them have already been mentioned by other panelists. But I think the one thing, and I hope we come back to this in some way, was the visceral anger of the mostly male crowd that I saw. And the source of this anger and the just the manifestation of it in their physical presence. And I think there's a lot of different answers to that. But of course, one of them that I thought of was that this is in direct response to a Black man being elected president. And this is Kamala Harris released a family Zoom yesterday, and it was just a Happy New Year sort of video, very lighthearted. But it was the point of this is sort of the American family, and there were lots of different ages and races, and I thought this is yet sort of another reason, from my perspective, why there is such anger, was so much anger displayed by that crowd on Wednesday, and then also trying to think about how it is that the Biden-Harris administration is going to address this in some policy way, and I hope that they do. Of course, it's an enormous challenge for them to do so. The second thing, and this is the point that Jonathan made, was the Confederate flag. I mean, that image is so chilling to see what looked to be the size of the Capitol paraded around. And to think that this had never happened before, again, was so symbolic of that racism. And then the third idea that I've been thinking about, or notion, is from just a total institutionalist perspective, is sort of the ever-growing and expanded powers of the presidency. And I was looking beforehand. I always quote that Truman said, "Congress meets, I don't know why," and I couldn't confirm whether or not he actually said that or not. So Rich, I'll have to ask you afterwards whether he did. But the point that I'm trying to make is that there's always been this, all branches of government have had natural tensions between the powers that they have, between Article 1, 2, and 3. And of course, the president since FDR has had expanded powers, and we see that dip with Nixon and then rise again with Reagan. And this was also this literal this literal example of the president overtaking the congressional branch and trying to deny the powers of Congress for doing something that they're constitutionally bound to do. So in my thinking of ever expanding powers of the presidency and the power that the president has to circumvent almost Congress and the courts often deferring to the president, this was really this sort of, again, this literal representation of the presidency overtaking the congressional branch. And I think that's much more dangerous. A strong president, doesn't matter who's there, whose name is on the door, and something that has been talked about, but I don't know that we've ever confronted in any sort of policy way. And certainly the courts have not been particularly interested in taking this issue up. So I'll stop there and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
I just wanted to build for a minute on what Jonathan had to say about the Capitol building itself. This is as he said, this is the great symbol of American democracy. I worked in and around the Capitol for 34 years in Washington, and there was never a day that I went to work that I didn't look up at that dome and feel inspired by it, and feel that it spoke to me. And felt tied to previous generations who had served there. And in fact, this armed incursion into the Capitol, which shocked me because it would never have occurred to me that it was even possible for that to occur, felt particularly personal. My wife and I were married in the Capitol building in front of one of those arched windows on the west front. And we were sitting the other day watching these rioters banging away at that window, trying to just smash it open. During World War II, when the Nazis bombed the House of Commons, flattened it, many in Britain wanted to build a newer, better, more modernized legislature. And Winston Churchill said, no, we shape our buildings and then they shape us. And he insisted on going back to the original plans for the House of Commons and just rebuilding it back up. And in much the same way, I felt really heartened later in the day, after they finally cleared the rioters out of the building, that the Congress came back and took control of it and went about its business late into the night. It's unfortunate that business had to take so long, and really just a ministerial step along the way of electing our president, which was dragged out by the same series of claims and lies and myths that in many ways fueled the demonstration itself. So let me, I'll stop with that, but let me ask anyone who wants to speak to this. I mean, we touched a little bit on Donald Trump, but we haven't yet really talked about whether and how he really was truly responsible for generating this mob that marched down Pennsylvania Avenue, and what will his accountability be going forward? Do we shrug and say, well, time to look forward, we've got a new administration, we've got important problems, let's get to work, forget about him? Or is it necessary for our democracy going forward to hold this president accountable?
I'll just jump
Yeah,
in.
sure, please do.
Just to start off, and I would make the argument that we need to think about the long view in terms of what started this anti-government, anti-legitimacy, distrust movement. And you can really hearken it back to Newt Gingrich's success in 1994 with the Contract with America, and the sort of crystallization of a narrative that was very appealing to more and more people, that rested on the turning of previous Southern Democratic voters who became Republicans based on race and civil rights and the Voting Rights Act, and a reaction to that to turn it back. And the codes were, well, we'll get the federal government out of our lives, just like in the 1870s and 1880s on Reconstruction. It's the same narrative, just packaged differently. And Newt Gingrich was a very smart strategist, and he managed to get suburban voters to say, okay, I don't want my taxes to be raised, and also get rural voters, white voters, to say, okay, they'll stop integrating our schools, they'll stop making us do affirmative action, they'll stop making us go liberal, or whatever that means. And this has been, it's not really as much Reagan as it is Gingrich, this very fierce narrative that, don't let them encroach. And if they encroach, you'll be invaded by the other. The anti-immigration rhetoric started by Gingrich. This has gone on for more, 30 years, 26 years or so. Donald Trump crystallized it. He capitalized on it. He fomented it. But this has been the GOP. This has been the Republican ticket to winning elections. And you can be critical of it normatively, but strategically, it's worked extraordinarily well for them for a very long time. And so to me, the impetus is not to punish Trump, to me, and to hold him accountable. Yes, of course. I think he'll be held accountable in his private life quite considerably. We've already seen the reaction to anything associated with Trump and the Republican Party. We can talk about later. But to wrap this up, it's about holding the Republican Party accountable for their electoral success based on messages that fundamentally undermine trust in government and foment at the very least, racial divide. And that there's got to be a reckoning for that. That an electoral reckoning might have happened and might continue to happen. The Democrats will figure out how to offer a counter narrative. That's, as Professor Collins said, that's what their mission is. And Professor Norland, what do they do? That's what they have to do. And so to me, it's a much bigger, more spread out sense of a responsibility, I think, for the way you win elections and what you do to get there. And I'm interested in seeing that play out for a longer period of time.
Anyone else want to speak to that? Yeah, Rose.
Yeah, if I could just follow on to Wendy's really important comments. One of the things that's been striking to me the last couple of days is to see that the money is leaving the Trump administration. So you see the National Manufacturers Bureau, you see these various corporations saying, not just that I'm not going to give money to Trump, but I'm not going to give money to those congressmen, those senators who actually supported challenging the certification of Biden. You see Stripe saying, we're not going to process any more donations to the Trump campaign. Once you start seeing money move away from the Republican Party, then I think you'll see the Republican Party change. And you've seen it, Liz Cheney just came out and basically said Donald Trump was responsible for the insurrection. You see Mitch McConnell apparently now supporting impeachment, which is unthinkable given what he did just a year ago. And the other thing I think is this issue with the big tech companies, not just banning Trump off Twitter and Facebook, but actually seeing Apple saying, we're not going to support Parler. We're not going to allow the hosting of these things. And whether or not you agree with stripping, Section 230 out of the law and ceasing liability protection for these social media companies, the issue of accountability and whether or not those companies have greater responsibility for restricting the town center where they can organize is an important consideration. People don't have a right to free speech, right? In the private sector, in the sense that they're not required to allow you to do that. So Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg can do exactly what they want. And it may be harder for them to organize on other platforms. It doesn't mean that they can't, but there'll be fewer of them. It'll take longer, and so on and so forth. But for, these big tech companies to claim that somehow they can't create an algorithm that can stop this is just ridiculous. They could do it in a day, the minute they're financially responsible for the consequences of what they support. And so I think the issue around social media is an important part of the wider discussion about the proliferation of not just of extremist groups and white supremacist groups, but groups antagonistic to trusting science, to trusting the government, to having these larger issues, trusting public health authorities, and so on. And so I think that that's part of the wider concern, and getting corporations and money going in a different direction is a big part of changing the direction of those movements, in my opinion.
Yeah, turn. Jonathan.
And if I could just add to that, and while I agree with Professor McDermott and Professor Schiller, I also think it's important that we also just really fortify how unprecedented and how problematic Trump's actual response is as well. Now, so I want to remind us of the words, right? So Trump initiates, this call to Washington, and he tells his supporters to quote unquote be there and be wild. Right. So this is the initial setting of stage. This is the initial sort of call to Washington: be there and be wild. And then he says these things during the rally. He says that we have to fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. So he's doing things that are, taking us beyond the sort of traditional parameters of presidential behavior and of, thinking about preserving democratic institutions. Right? He's looking to deliberately incite a riot. And, I recognize that the Republican Party and Newt Gingrich played a role in the more draconian form of politics that we've been seeing between Democrats and Republicans over the past couple of decades. But Trump has taken things to a different level. And we have to really ask ourselves where we expect things to go from here on out. Because are we going to return to a more civil form of draconian politics? Or is this the new normal? Is American politics now about who can rile up their supporters the most? And whether that means inciting violence, whether that means encouraging people to be there and be wild, whether that means telling people that we won't accept the rules, that if we want it, we have to take it. I mean, would this kind of language become what's necessary to gain political support and therefore even be successful or even competitive in elections? I mean, this is a real fear that I think is unique to Donald Trump that might move forward, irrespective of kind of what we've been doing institutionally in the past.
Yes, I agree with you. And that's the reason why I emphasize the personal accountability of Donald Trump. It's not so much to, out of revenge or something of that sort, but it's the fear that if the president is unaccountable for this kind of behavior, are we establishing a template which could be picked up by maybe even a worse despot in the future? Worse because with all of the authoritarian tendencies that Trump showed, he was not really very effective at it. And so then the question becomes, what about the next guy or the next woman, who is a more effective politician, but understands what it is that made Trump successful. And we watch politicians like Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz vying for that Trump mantle. And I think it'll be very interesting in the weeks ahead now to see whether they try to distance themselves a bit from that, as the table seems to be turning somewhat, or whether they double down in the belief that that this kind of Trumpism is a permanent part of the modern Republican Party. Carrie, you had something you...
Yeah, I just wanted to, I've been thinking a lot about the question that Jonathan posed about how do we just, Biden is inaugurated and everyone just goes home and we're all better then. And I think what has been really striking to me is that people saw, I've seen the polls that 60% of Americans disagree with what happened, but that still leaves 40% who has some other feeling. And so people did see two different realities in those images on Wednesday. And I wonder, and I think a lot about the point that Trump really hit again and again, and this theme of it's a broken system, and the system has lied to you, it's stolen this election from you. We had to fight like hell. All the terms and the words and phrases that he used to really get his people even more motivated. And you just think, where does this go? Because that rift isn't something that is going away. I think it's been around for a very long time. Talking to people close to me, it was, the theme was bad people doing bad things, bad apples, but, the most of the crowd didn't do that bad stuff. And so, while certainly I saw something far different than that, there is a large part of the country that, or not a large, but some parts of the country that didn't see that. And I think that's something that we have to contend with, but it's hard for me to understand how we do that, and whether or not that comes from a Biden-Harris White House. That's an open question for me.
Yeah, I've been talking to people on the Hill all week, and I've talked to many staffers and others who say that the experience was far worse than kind of what was conveyed on social media and on the main media channels, and that there were portions of the crowd that knew exactly where they wanted to go and exactly who they were looking for. And, also that the level of damage was much greater than we've seen and are aware of, and that they broke into offices all over the Capitol building, and many of them were basically ransacked. And, the reason I underline this is, it's not clear that it's over. I mean, we have the FBI warning that there could be a follow-on attack at the US Capitol. And they went on to say attacks at all 50 state capitals. So, if so, that's a giant conspiracy, really. And we touched on high tech, in a different context a moment ago. But another thing about the internet and these platforms is the way that it enables this kind of action. That years ago, it would have been unthinkable for the, whoever it was, the John Birch Society and the Ku Klux Klan to get together and invade the Capitol. Mostly, extreme politically violent groups were small and isolated and didn't really have the means to rise up in quite this way. But now that they've done that, the question is also, have they weaponized this highly polarized political environment that we're in? In other words, having exploded out, are we likely now to see a period of greater violence?
I think all of these things are extraordinarily important, and we should be deeply concerned. But we live in a society, of course, according to the Western world, at least we compare ourselves to Europe, that is incredibly violent to begin with. And certainly, obviously, African Americans in the South were subject to enormous violence, still are. And I remember the Byrd case in Texas, the horrific racial violence in Texas, not that long ago. And certainly, we have more gun deaths than most of the Western world. We are a violent society, and I think that it's distressing to me that we have allowed people to walk around with AK-47s or AR-15, 14 rifles in public squares. I just, and now we're saying, well, in order to combat that, we're going to have the army walking around the town square with assault weapons. And that is not, I think, the society we want to live in. If anybody's traveled abroad to Latin America or the Middle East or any other kind of country, you'll see people with machine guns everywhere. That's not really the way I think most Americans want to live. So to your point, it will require far more than ringing the Capitol with the National Guard, which they're doing now. And let's not forget that this may have been a conspiracy. There are a lot of people who may have been involved that let it happen, but it was so woefully unprotected. It was so woefully unprepared. I have more faith that with preparation, they'll be able to stop some of these activities without question. And to Professor Norland's point, we've had division that runs deep. The Nixon impeachment, the Nixon resignation, that was an extraordinarily divided time. If we had a better polling apparatus, we'd have similar poll numbers. You know, Nixon was what, 28% when he left, you know, and Donald Trump today in one poll is 33%. So when you think about that, the divisions persist. And I think it's going to be up to local communities. Frankly, I think to myself, what can we say on this panel that says to people, what can you do individually? What can you do? Well, I was cheating and reading some of the questions, and people say, well, I talk to people and they don't believe me. What can I do? And we have to, you know, think about look at Black Lives Matter this summer. These are ordinary people getting out the door, young, old, whatever it is, and marching, 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 and not giving up on it. That is the response. It can't just rely on government or the military, which we hope stands tall. But we have to decide as a society what will be acceptable and what not. And so, yes, I agree that Trump has a lot of responsibility, but I fear that looking at Trump alone and not stepping back and saying, what do we do when we hear a slur? What do we do when we hear disparaging science? What do we do as individuals? And what are the other mechanisms that we can do through legislation, like gun control, for example? What are the kinds of things we can do on a much broader scale? I'm just thinking much broader, and at the same time, requiring each and every one of us to be active, to do something to thwart this. So that's where my head is at. It's not diminishing the role of Trump in any way or the seriousness of what's happening in the next 2 weeks, but thinking, what do we do literally for the next 10, 20 years?
I think there's also a lesson to pull away from what's happening, because I think what happens too frequently is we conflate conservatism and white supremacy, and we kind of see them as sort of happening simultaneously and therefore the same thing. And I think what we've seen is where they start to diverge, and violence tends to be the big mechanism for divergence here. Because think about it, we had protests at the state capitals around the reopening of the economy, and these were people who felt like their personal rights were being infringed upon. I shouldn't be forced to succumb to these mandates that are happening, even if it's for my own public health. That's your preference, your prerogative, that's fine. But violence never really surfaced during these protests that were happening consistently across state capitals. But when we see this protest happening, this demonstration, this riot, this insurrection happening at the US Capitol, it's extremely violent. And the language underneath it is really violent. And then it opens our eyes to this trend of the fact that white supremacy has always been violent. That's the smoking gun of white supremacy, is violence. White supremacy has never been peaceful. You never hear of a peaceful white supremacist protest. You never heard of the Ku Klux Klan singing songs and hymns without any kind of violence attached. And if there's anything that we should be looking to do, it's continuing the momentum from the summer, which is trying to mobilize around identifying and eradicating the violence that seems to consistently surface when white supremacy enters the table. And hopefully what we learned from last week is that there aren't any limits to the violent behavior that white supremacists are willing to enact. No institution is safe. No sacred space is safe. And so if this can't mobilize us and sort of create some sense of solidarity, I don't really know what will.
Does it make sense to go ahead with the inaugural on the west front of the Capitol?
Yes, we have to.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell and Vice President Pence, I think, made an extraordinary, courageous decision, but it was so important, as you pointed out, to go back into the Capitol at just about 8 o'clock that night, less than 6 hours after the tremendous terror, and say, as Mike Pence said, let's get back to work. And he gave the most strongly emotive statement we've ever seen Mike Pence give. He was so angry.
Yes.
And I thought it was an important, courageous moment. And I think that they went back in, that they still challenged the election, we can sort of debate, but nonetheless, that they went back in and stayed there till almost 4 o'clock in the morning to get it done was incredibly strong signal. And I think what Joe Biden said, I believe yesterday, which was, I'm doing this outside. I'm doing this where I'm supposed to do it. And I have faith that I'll be protected. And that's it. That's all. That you can't cancel it. It's, scary, but you can't. Because I think then the symbolism becomes even more victorious than they were already sort of celebrating, as Professor Norland pointed out.
You don't think doing it inside is a reasonable option? Televise it?
No, I don't. I don't. I am concerned, like everybody else. I think now is the moment when we say we can protect the commander in chief, we can protect the vice president of the United States, we can protect the other former presidents who are coming. There's some rumor, I have no idea if this is true, but I've read about it, that it's possible, not only Vice President Pence is planning to attend the inauguration, that in fact, Ivanka Trump has suggested that she might attend in lieu of her father. Now, I don't know if that's
She's a
true.
fool. There's no way she's going to show up.
But listen, if she did, whatever the motives, it would go a long way to preventing violence. Because if the theory about Trump's hold on these insurrectionists is true, if we believe it's all about Trump, they're not going to do anything to harm Trump's daughter. So it's possible. I'm not saying it happens, but it's something that if you're the next generation of the Trump family, you'd think seriously about, because I think the Trump name is going to need a little restoration. So you may scoff at it, but I think it would be insurance. Whether you want to get the insurance that way, it would be insurance, I think, in some way of mitigating the possibility of extreme violence.
I don't think you're wrong. I just don't think she'll do it.
I don't know.
I
I
100%
agree with you.
agree.
I just think she won't do it.
I'm just throwing it out there.
The
Well,
only
let-
other point, sorry, that I wanted to make on top of Professor Schiller's was that I think it's so important for Kamala Harris as the first woman of color, female vice president, to stand out there in the open and take her oath of office in front of everybody as well. I think, I feel like everything now is a conspiracy theory of some kind, and that, if there's only that the moon landing has now been faked and everything, it just feels like everything can be faked in some way. And so to take some of that out of it by having it public, outside, etc., I think it's so important to the legitimacy of the new administration.
Yeah, and I agree. And I'm not making light of it, but I remember that after 9/11, George W. Bush went to Yankee Stadium. I remember this because I'm a Billy Crystal fan, and Billy Crystal tells the story about sitting next to him. And they were surrounded by the most incredible, Professor McDermott is a military expert, bulletproof glass. It was as if they were in a bubble that could not be penetrated. And I expect that the vice president, president, and the former presidents will be in that bubble. But Billy Crystal tells it that when the president left, they took down the bubble. So of course, but I expect that they will have those kinds of precautions. So it won't be the kind of transparent access that we come to expect. I don't expect to see them clear. I expect them to be protected by that kind of shielding at the very least. So it won't be the same as it's always been outside.
Yeah, well, the coronavirus will make sure that that's the case.
Well, and I think if we look at the way that violence has been occurring and the aggressive action has been occurring, it's been more for spectacle than for actual volatile damage. We haven't seen acts employed in a way where we're looking for where the end goal seems to be some sort of assassination or some sort of fatal damage. It's for spectacle, it's for show, it's to send messages, it's to be symbolic, it's to be symbolically aggressive and resistant. And I do expect to see that kind of behavior on display during the inauguration. But to Professor Schiller's point, I do think it's important to have the counter narrative standing up against that, which is, we are going to engage in the peaceful transition of power, whether you like it or not, because, this is the way our democracy functions, and it was here before us and it'll be here after you.
So for just a few minutes, so the audience questions are piling up, so we'll turn to the audience questions in a minute. But for just a minute, I wanted to honor the title of this program and maybe take a quick look forward at what it is that the incoming president is now faced with. What's he likely wanting to do, And what is he likely able to do?
This is quick. I'm not thinking beyond the coronavirus. I am not thinking beyond handling the pandemic. I don't think anybody can do anything unless they get a handle on this. There won't be the receptivity to it. We can't get started on anything else. I think you should take the most extreme measures possible to distribute the vaccine in ways that we can't even imagine. Whether that means federalizing the National Guard in every single state and having the medical personnel in the National Guard administer vaccines 24 hours a day. Whatever it has to be akin to a World War II kind of effort. And I am not thinking beyond it because I just don't think there's space in the practicality of things to get anything done until we do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, and I would add that there's a reasonable prospect of some bipartisan cooperation in that area, which is a sensible thing to do at the beginning of a presidency anyway. You know, it was one of the first early shocks about President Trump that he never understood that point and never made an effort in 4 years to reach beyond his base. But Joe Biden does get that. And of course, his rhetoric has been all about trying to unify the country. And so I think those are additional reasons why what you say makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
Anyone
I
else?
also think I'll let Professor Collins go.
Well, and I was just going to say, I expect Biden to play from the Obama administration playbook. Obviously, he helped write the playbook himself. And one interesting parallel between Obama entering in 2008 and Biden entering in 2020 is crisis. Obama enters the presidency in the midst of a terrible economic crisis. And it's all about economic recovery at that point. Every economic policy that's put into place for the first couple of years is single-handedly geared towards economic recovery and stimulus. Well, what are we looking at now? We're looking at a different version of the same thing, where it's all about economic stimulus and it's all about ways to get a handle on crisis. So, he's prepared to do that, and that's what we should see.
And I think Biden is likely to be more effective at it than the early Obama. Simply because of, he understands the legislative branch. He's had a long career there, very successfully. He was the most successful bridge between the Obama administration and the Congress was Joe Biden. And I think that he's likely to be more effective in terms of dealing with Congress than it took Obama a while in those early years to get a handle really on how to deal with the Congress.
I have a question, actually, I've been thinking a lot about, and that is, of course, that the Senate is the vice president is the tiebreaker. Does Biden go for a big budget bill in which he puts infrastructure in it as well? And so he doesn't have to have to do something for 60 votes? I've been really curious about how he handles the Senate.
Well, I do think that they will go relatively early on for a budget resolution for the purpose of creating reconciliation instructions, and that will allow them to have a reconciliation bill, which only takes a simple majority for passage. Now, what gets included in that or not, I think that's something that's still being very strongly debated in Biden circles, but I think you are likely to see something like that. And there were some people who were arguing for putting the Corona bill inside of that. But others who have argued much along the lines of what Wendy was saying, that this makes a lot of sense for it to be the first thing to do, and don't spend your reconciliation ace on the COVID bill, because you might be able to get that passed by itself and, use reconciliation for something that's going to be more difficult to do if you can't do it by simple majority.
Rich, if I can also just add a little bit about the
Sure.
foreign policy angle. I completely agree with Professor Schiller that it's all about the pandemic until they get the pandemic under control. But I think that one of the ways that Biden will be really different than the Trump administration is on climate change and on issues related to environmental regulation, or in some cases, undoing the deregulation that the Trump administration has done. And this is one place where I think it can overlap with what Professor Collins just said about economic recovery. By emphasizing things like green jobs and infrastructure that builds in a more green way, I think that you can sort of try to get to, two bangs for the buck. I'm not sure if he'll be able to do that completely, but I do think that he'll emphasize more rejoining Paris. The stuff came out today that there was a 20% reduction in carbon this year because of the pandemic. We always said it was impossible to achieve that kind of goal in a short period of time. Well, guess what? We did it. We did it in the wrong way for the wrong reason, but it shows it's possible, right? And so you can't say it's not possible. The other thing I'll say really quickly before ending is the other thing which I think that he will try to, if not restore, at least try to open renegotiations is the Iran nuclear deal, and to think about the ways in which, obviously proliferation was one of Obama's signature issues, things that he cared about, worked on, and considered to be the Iran nuclear accord to be a major achievement. You can't go back to 2016 now, but I think attempting to try to reopen those negotiations in a way that allows the international community to try and reintegrate Iran more into the international community in a kind of economic way, at least, I think he'll be very, very different than the Trump administration. I know a lot of people are emphasizing issues with China, but I just don't think that's going to be in the early days, the emphasis so much as climate and Iran. I could be wrong, but that's my sense of it.
Let me just throw one last observation into the pot about the Senate, and that is that Biden will face, and that is in a 50-50 Senate, Joe Manchin will be king. For those who don't know about him, he's the most conservative member of the Democratic caucus in the Senate, so he's the 50th vote, and he's not shy about using that leverage, and he'll have it on, every major piece of legislation going forward. Okay, let's turn to the audience for some questions and comments. And the first one is from Stephen Neufeld, who says, many people are referring to mob attack as an insurrection incited by the president, but not as a coup. Do you think there's a difference? If so, what is it? And if not, why do you think most people seem to be refraining from using the word coup? Anybody want to take that one?
I could take a stab and then I'll let
Sure.
Professor Schiller, if she wants to add it. I think some of it is actually the way that coup traditionally is understood to be the military trying to overtake the government. And in this case, the military did not in any way, shape, or form as an institution, right? There may have been individuals overtake the government. And so that's why I think it doesn't get called a coup.
Right.
There are some people who've been calling it a coup in the sense that there was an insurrection that tried to overturn the government, but it wasn't the organized military. And that's what separates it out, at least in the kind of technical sense, from being a coup, the way that we think about coups that occurred in the 1980s in South America, where the military came in
Right.
with a junta and
Right.
took over. I've definitely heard jokes like, who would have thought that people would have wanted the military to take over in the United States from Trump? And, obviously that's facetious, but the notion of coup traditionally is associated with the institution of the military taking over. And that's not the case. I'll let Wendy Schiller add to that.
No, I think that's perfect.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Richard Brown says, given all the crises that the Biden administration faces, what will be, I'm sorry, it just skipped on me all of a sudden. Given all the crises that the Biden administration faces, what will be the priority of healthcare of healthcare reform, how much reform will be possible with the small majorities Democrats have in both houses, and how much reform will a Biden attempt in 4 years?
I actually I don't think it'll be on the front burner because the one thing you can do is ensure or extend the Medicaid expansion guarantee. So Obamacare had, when you signed up to expand your population to, I think it's 138%, but don't hold me to it, a poverty level for Medicaid under Obamacare, the federal government would pay the cost of that 100% for 3 years. Normally there's a cost sharing between the states and the federal government in the Medicaid insurance program for low-income individuals. So he could extend that. He could say for the new states, like Idaho just joined, Utah just joined by state referendum. A couple of states have joined recently. He could say, well, anybody who joins up now, who still hasn't done it, I'll give you 5 years of an extension of 100% Medicaid.
Mm-hmm.
There's ways in which you can take the existing infrastructure, which is spread to Arizona, Kentucky, as I said, Republican states, Utah, Idaho. These states have said yes to this, usually by letting the voters decide. That would be a smart way of doing it because it's Republican country, Republican territory. It'd be hard for the Senate Republicans to oppose that. And the second thing is home health care workers. We know that they're among the lowest paid among a lot of healthcare workers. And we've seen how incredibly important they've been in the COVID pandemic. They're still going to work. They're taking care of people who have disability or who are older or need help, and they're not paid enough money. And that is something I think also, as Professor Ehrenberg said, you could get Republicans and Democrats behind a federal bill that insists on some sort of wage or subsidy, a state subsidy for home care workers.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those types of bills that are targeted towards particular people and making sure they have health care could have a fairly strong chance of success. I don't think Medicare for All has any chance of success in the next 2 years. So if I were the advisors, I would not advise him to pursue it.
Yeah.
Can I add one thing though? I'm curious to see what the new Health and Human Services Becerra is going to do with regard to some of this, because his history in California is he basically broke the back of Sutter, right? So Sutter was the healthcare company that was the most expensive in the country. He sued them, he won. They had to pay the state of California back well over $100 million. And so I'm curious to see the extent to which he actually goes after some of these HMOs for, violating cost limitations and so on. And the second piece is really the cost of COVID. So there's going to be a bunch of these insurance companies that are going to come pretty close to going under, because when you've got somebody on a ventilator for 6 weeks and then they don't even die, they're going to have to be in like rehab for the rest of their life. These companies are going to go bankrupt. There's nobody with a big enough pocket to cover how expensive COVID is going to be except the federal government. And that may be the step into single payer, because it may be the only way that the insurance companies can be bailed out. I'm not saying that we'll get there, but I'm increasingly hearing physicians talk about issues around reimbursement. So when you see big hospitals saying, we can't afford to stop elective surgeries because that's the only way we're getting paid, and we have to because our ICU capacity is at 0, how are we going to pay our workers? You're in a conundrum. And politically, the only way you're going to break the back around that, if the insurance companies go under, is to have the federal government come in, and they have to use that as leverage. They can't be like, okay, we're going to bail out Blue Cross and then just walk away. They're going to be like, we're now Blue Cross, right? And so thinking how that's going to happen, I think it depends a lot on, again, to Professor Schiller's point, how the pandemic plays out. If you get it under control quickly, it might not come to this. If it ends up being as bad as it could be, you might have no other choice.
Okay. It's a question from Maddie Verdi, a student from the class of 2024. She says, I've heard a lot of discourse regarding the semantics around discussing the insurrection at the Capitol last week, whether it's called a riot, mob, insurrection, coup, or protest. What are the implications of the specific word choices that popular media make to analyze this incident historically and otherwise?
That's a good question.
Stumped the panel, it looked like.
Well, I'm doing a terrible thing as a panelist, and I'm going to push it to Professor Nordland, partly for generational reasons, because I'm considerably older than she is. But she's also an expert on mobilization and on rhetoric. And I think we are a visual culture as much as we are a written or verbal culture. And I think the images from this are probably as important, if not more important, than the descriptive terms we use. But I'm gonna push it over to Carrie Norland and see what she's got to say.
Well, thanks, Professor Schiller. That was very kind. I think that what has struck me most about the words being used in the semantics has been around terrorist, rioter, protester, and that the big newspapers, and we can talk about the coverage of this, decided very quickly, and the cable news channels decided very quickly, some did, that they weren't going to say protesters and they were going to say rioters, or they were going to say domestic terrorists. I prefer terrorists because I feel like they're all the same. And that descriptive term was going to be used as a way to mark this as something other than what Jonathan was referring to earlier about, you don't see the KKK singing hymns and quoting verses and having peaceful protests. And some of those two words are linked together. And when we think about effective social movements, those are often the ways that I think historically those narratives have been constructed and composed. So I've paid attention to this debate because I think it is really important how it is that what the narrative is and how it is that we decide to describe this particular moment, because language reflects thought, and the way that we think about this is incredibly cast this in a particular light. And I don't think there's any way to soft pedal what happened on Wednesday and to use the kinder terms that one might want to. And I do think that the mainstream media, for what they're worth, took some responsibility for this pretty early on in their coverage as well.
Great, thanks. Jock McLeese asks, how will we deal with the misinformation on Fox and other right-wing outlets? I have friends convinced there is a deep state and the election was a fraud, and nothing I tell them and no information or articles I send them will shake their conviction. And these are intelligent people.
Now,
And
I just really quickly, I was quoted earlier in a different venue saying, the mug shots are going to replace the triumphant shots with the flags. Although I think the Confederate flag, fortunately and unfortunately, will be persistent in coverage, both to attack it and also to promote it. But I think mugshots, we're going to see a lot more mugshots coming forth. And Fox News has been showing them. If you go to their webpage, they also show them. And sooner or later, they're going to have to cover that. And so it's not as if you personally are going to have to combat it. But when there are consequences, which is not atypical of the Trump universe, for the people that supported the president, which is basically jail time, this is going to sink in. Maybe not to everybody, but it will sink in. And I think that's what will start, I think, to take things down a notch. And I do think Congress and state capitals, state legislators, elected officials are going to have to help do that. But I do think you give it a little time. And now it all looks like a big triumphant raid on the Capitol. But in a couple of weeks, I think the imagery is really going to change.
Yeah, if I can just add two things to that. One is apparently the FBI came out today and said that there's a lot of images that haven't yet been shown. And that once people actually see the level of violence that took place, it will really shift things. And I think if there are pictures, for example, of, particular congressmen being, physically attacked or whatever, I don't know what the footage is, and that could shift things, as Professor Schiller said. The other is I'm just going to go back to the social media companies and say, we really have to start thinking seriously about having liability protections stripped from these social media companies, so that it may not change the past, but it could at least change things going forward, so that hate speech and some of these other, really violent extremist things don't have a place to organize and without censure. And I think that that's a really important remediation. There's always going to be people who believe in conspiracy theories. There's always going to be people whose minds you can't change. There's always going to be people who say, I'm not a racist, I really care about the economy. Maybe for some of them it's true, and for others it's just a cover for the fact that they're racist and don't want to admit it. You know, there's all kinds of people with all kinds of issues. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a persuadable middle. And that if you can target the people who are persuadable and not the extreme people who you're never going to get at, you can at least get to a majority that allows for some kind of compromise and some kind of governance going forward. And to me, the key of that persuadable middle is to regulate the social media companies who, you know, have had way too much free license for way too long.
Okay.
Can I just,
Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead,
one of
Sarah.
Professor McDermott's point, which I think is so interesting, is that social media, who have for so long said that they were not media companies, have now, like, the mask is off and had to admit, oh, we actually are media companies. So I think that's really, really interesting. And then to the gentleman's question too, I mean, this is something I think about all the time, about how to, you know, talk to people that we don't disagree with. And I think there has to be something that we have in common that we can talk about. And it used to be the weather, but I don't know that we can talk about the weather anymore, because, but there is something. And like, what is that? What is the thing that you can talk to your fill in the blank friend, neighbor, cousin about that isn't so electric? And I think part of that is having social media companies actually be responsible for what they are actually putting out there. But they're just, I mean, we're all human, and there is something, and this is probably too naive and Pollyanna, but there is something that unites us, and like, we actually have to like uncover that in ourselves somewhere, because no one wants an article to read should change what I think. Like, none of us want that. And so what is that?
I think that one of additional problems too, though, with the news media companies in particular, is the fact that we do have these 24-hour news networks that are profit driven. That's just not really healthy for a democratic society. So the idea of 24-hour news is insane, right? Like, in order to generate viewership, you have to continue to project some sort of news event that continues to happen. So we create spectacle. We sort of traffic in spectacle in a way with 24-hour network news. And then in addition to that, again, the profit-driven aspect. Fox News needs commercial ads in order to sustain itself, right? And so it's going to continue to show the things that attract the most viewers, that attract the most revenue for its commercial ad base. And so, like, until we can do something more substantively, I think, in terms of like, you know, tying profit away from news, I think we're still going to continue to see some of these things. So either one of the two things have to change. We have to either find ways to regulate what news companies can do, or we have to change the preferences of viewers, and they have to say, no more spectacle, just show me the real news and show me real fact. And until one of those two things changes, I think we're still going to see this kind of Fox News dilemma that the question sort of poses.
Yeah, one of the difficulties there, I think, is just that truth and facts are often difficult.
And boring.
Boring. You're right. You're right. Jock had a second question, a follow-on question. He asks, he says, I'm worried about the people in the police who supported and helped the rioters. I fear that is true in the military as well. And although the leaders follow the Constitution, what happens in 20 years as some of these people rise in rank?
Professor McDermott, you're the specialist. You don't want to take this question?
Yeah, I mean, I
Right.
was talking to a friend of mine in Germany today, because they've just actually arrested a bunch of people in Germany in the military and the police force who were sort of part of the opposition to the government. And so I think part of it is, you know, how do you actually police the police, right? Do you do it through infiltration? Do you get the FBI counterterrorism group to work with them? What if the FBI counterterrorism group is actually filled with people who are sympathetic to, you know, right-wing tendencies? I think it's very problematic. There were reports that 3 different European countries claimed that a fifth of the Capitol Police force was sympathetic to the insurrectionists on Wednesday. It's very hard to know where they got that number from, or like, were they out there in the crowds polling people with, spies? Like, how is it that they got that number? But I myself saw images of Capitol cops opening up the bicycle rails to let some of the protesters in. And so there obviously was, if not coordination, at least some complicity. I heard today that there were 70 people that were being investigated and some number who had been arrested, one for taking a selfie, one for showing someone else, one of the rioters, into one of the offices and so on. And so I suspect going forward that there will be a lot more arrests. And to Professor Schiller's point, a lot of mugshots. The FBI said today that there were going to be exponentially more arrests, and that a lot of those included people in the Capitol Police. And so obviously it's not just the Capitol Police. There may be people of the National Guard who are sympathetic. There may be, DC cops. I mean, it's hard to know, but I think though finding and rooting out those people are really, really important, and how to do that is challenging.
Yeah, and of course, at the same time, there were many members of the Capitol Police who did really heroic things.
Saved their lives, right? Two of them
I
were
mean,
killed.
we had senators in the Senate chamber and congressmen and women in the House chamber, and somehow miraculously they all got out safely, and that was a credit to the Capitol Police.
Well, and it's to the point both that Professor Collins and you, Rich Ehrenberg, made earlier about, it was awful, but it could have been so much worse. I mean, if those protesters had had AK-47s and gone to the Senate chamber and actually annihilated the Senate, I mean, this is again one of those places where the 25th Amendment and some of our laws, what if actually everybody in Congress had been killed in some mass casualty event? I'm pretty concerned that it was, in fact, going to be a super spreader event. How many of those people are actually going to die of the virus? But three of them have already tested positive, who were hunkered down. It's interesting to me because I don't know who got vaccinated and so on, but at least one of the people who tested positive had one dose of the vaccine, which tells you it's not as effective as they're claiming. And so, it's not just the super spreader of people who are hunkered down in the building in the basement. It's all the people who are hanging out inside the Capitol without masks, shoulder to shoulder for hours, who are going back to South Dakota and Alabama and, wherever else they come from. And so, I think that this will seed a pretty big super spreader event. I hope I'm wrong, but that's one of my big concerns.
Yeah.
When I saw it Wednesday, I was like, oh, this is not good.
It's not the best ventilated building in the world either.
Well, and apparently those rooms that are safe rooms are actually built to not have ventilation because they were worried about anthrax and stuff coming in. And so they actually don't have any ventilation.
Yeah.
And so, it's not surprising now. So far, 3 have tested positive. Who knows how many more? But there could be Congress people who die as a result of this. And then you're actually thinking about, sort of manslaughter charges.
Something else I'm particularly worried about too is the level of coordination between the president and then members of, whether it's the security staff, the police who are on hand. If there is evidence that surfaces from the investigation that the White House was directly coordinating to allow this to happen, this is a huge problem that opens up the litigation purview of this whole thing in a much wider fashion. And so, I mean, we've heard, we've seen the description, and we've heard sort of people refer to it as a potential quote unquote inside job, but to find evidence that this coordinates, I mean, this is the plot of a Christopher Nolan film at this point, right? And now we're opening. Go ahead.
Sorry, something that supports that it at least comes up to the edge of that is that the restraining the use of the National Guard for hour after hour.
Yep.
Okay, Aaron Arkins says, hello, everyone, and thank you for this conversation. what are the ways that you envision the Biden administration addressing, one, the spread of misinformation online, and two, the growing threat of domestic terrorism fueled by white nationalism?
We might have already covered a bit of that, I think,
Mhm.
in our conversation. You know, again, going back to the sort of fundamental shift in power structure, power centers, it's not really up to the government. It's really online is owned privately. It's not like, you know, I grew up with 3 television stations plus PBS, right? So 4 television stations. There were no cable when I was a kid. And the radio airwaves are also, before satellite, were controlled by the government as well through licensing. When the government no longer controls the infrastructure and the licensing, really not a lot the government can do. So I'll just add that to whatever we said
Yeah.
before about the Biden's administration capacity to get this under control. I think it's you know, Tocqueville said it best, and if you've ever seen Professor Jim Morone, he quotes him frequently, that we are a country of local communities, and you know, trying to look to the top to combat this is probably not going to be the most effective strategy.
I would just add, though, thinking of Professor Collins's point about the choice about whether or not the government, when thinking about the 24-hour profit-driven news cycle, which I think is crazy as well, but for the government to step in and regulate. And I mean, I don't know that there's a whole lot of appetite for that at the government level, given how much money telecoms give to the candidates, but let's suspend that for just a second. I mean, that could be one way that government addresses this issue. But I mean, of course, I mean, there are like about 10,000 more pressing issues than that as of this moment.
No, but it wasn't accidental that Twitter and Facebook banned Trump the day, literally, that the Democrats got control of Congress, right? I mean, that was not accidental. That was like, holy shit, we're going to lose 230. You know, that people aren't dumb. And if it's driven by profit, as I agree with Professor Collins, it is, they knew where their bread was buttered, and they knew they needed to shift their horses that they were backing.
I do
Lorna,
think,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
just real quick I do think though that the Biden administration, one of the things that they can do is communication. So having a press secretary that actively engages with the public, and as opposed to sort of dodging questions from the press. And then also having a president that is receptive to taking questions from the press and engaging with the press, not condemning and undermining the credibility of the press. I mean, this is a big thing. I mean, you know, fake news is a part of the lexicon now, and it wasn't, you know, 4 years ago. You know, and you know, being able to move forward into a place where we can no longer see the media constantly, at least the press, the free press, constantly badgered and beaten up by, you know, the most powerful person in the world. This is a huge win that I don't want us to underestimate moving forward with the Biden-Harris administration.
Just not having 50 tweets a day. I mean, like, what a relief. Just the last few days, it's just like, it feels like having an alarm in your head that just stops. I mean, it's like huge.
And it's always like 2 a.m. too when they come out.
Yeah.
Lorna Aratani from the class of '84 asked, and she's watching us from Honolulu, Hawaii,
Oh, my
and she
hometown.
asks, please discuss whether the president would be able to effectively give a preemptive pardon to himself and his family.
Yes. Can. He's apparently, hi Lorna, hi to the Hawaii Brown Club, a very wonderful hosts a couple of years ago. Yeah, he can. Apparently, and other people can comment, he's being talked out of it, which I didn't think of this actually. So maybe he's still got 1 or 2 good lawyers that surrounding him, that if he pardons himself, he acknowledges a crime. And if he pardons himself for the crime, he can be sued in civil court for damages coming out of the insurrection. And those are going to be a lot of damages. So every member of Congress can sue him, vice president can sue him, anybody who was hurt can sue him. So he opens himself up to even greater liability than he might possibly have as a private citizen. So apparently that is possibly what keeps him from doing it.
And of course, as he pardons all these people around him, they lose their Fifth Amendment right. But by virtue of having been pardoned, they can't incriminate themselves. And so they lose the Fifth Amendment right to testify in potential cases against the president, for that matter.
And self-pardon on the part of the president has not been adjudicated in the Supreme Court. So we actually don't know which way they'll go. I mean, we can assume that they'd side with him, but we don't actually know that because they're smart and they play the long game, and they might think, oh, if we set this precedent, then a Democratic president who comes along who does something I don't like will also have the right. And there is a way that it sort of gives license to criminality to say, you can do whatever you want and then pardon yourself. And that fundamentally goes against the goal of the framers to not create a monarchy.
Well, in a funny sort of way, President Trump, if he does pardon himself, invites a prosecution to test whether we're going to have that as a reality going forward, that any president can just pardon himself. Okay, I think we've got probably time for one more.
Rich, I think we have to talk about the filibuster, don't we?
Yeah.
I looked ahead and there were
I would never say no to that question.
There were several questions to ask you about the filibuster. So I'm not just, I have a self-serving question, but also several of the viewers have asked as well.
Okay, I haven't seen any of those as I'm scrolling through, but
Well, let me summarize. Should the Democrats get rid of the filibuster once they take control? Yes or no, for their own political gain? And, there you go.
yeah. Well, first of all, they won't, because I'm quite sure there aren't 50 votes in the caucus to do it. I mentioned Joe Manchin before. He's made it very clear that he doesn't agree with that. And it's not clear that Joe Biden agrees with eliminating the filibuster. In fact, many of you have heard me say this before, but when I wrote the book about the filibuster in 2012, I got a handwritten note from then Vice President Joe Biden saying that this book should be required reading for every member of the Senate. So at least that recently, he was still very much against it. And he made a very strong and articulate speech on the Senate floor in 2005 against eliminating the filibuster. Although on the other side of that coin, the Senate is historically not all that interested in what the president thinks about their roles.
So can I propose a lightning round?
Sure, sure. Okay.
Two things. One is, do we think Lisa Murkowski becomes an independent? And so then she becomes as important as Joe Manchin and as valuable and as influential. She's up for re-election in Alaska in 2022. She's won before as an independent write-in candidate.
Sure.
And the second is, does Biden's nominee for Secretary of Defense get confirmed? Me, the first African-American Secretary of Defense in our history. So lightning round. I'll go first. I think Lisa Murkowski does become an independent at some point in the next 6 to 9 months. And I don't know enough about the nominee, but I suspect Biden named 4 cabinet posts he wants done within the first week of the Senate, and defense is one of them. So I'm going to go with he gets confirmed. So those are my guesses.
50-50 Senate does lend itself to people thinking about party changing their party. Of course, the last time we had a 50-50 Senate was in 2001, and Jim Jeffords, the Republican senator from Vermont, changed to an independent, and then caucused with the Democrats in the Democratic caucus, shifting the Democrats into the majority. So with it's evenly balanced like that, one senator going in either direction can change it.
I think I agree. Lisa Murkowski does become an independent. I think it fits it fits Alaska, it fits her write-in, how she won 6 years ago. And Secretary of Defense, I think he gets him, and I think he gets his entire cabinet. I think they've been pretty safe on those picks. I mean, Merrick Garland came out. I mean, that announcement came out like, whatever, how many hours after they won Georgia, or Georgia was certified, or John Ossoff won. So I think he ends up getting his entire cabinet too.
I think that Murkowski will do that. I think she may actually not be the only one, depending on what happens with the Republican Party. I can imagine others at least moving in the direction of becoming more independent. The thing about the Secretary of Defense is interesting. I do agree he'll get confirmed, but this really, really, really pissed off the women in the National Security Council, who really wanted Michelle Flournoy as the first female, Secretary of Defense, and they felt like there were lots of other positions that went to minority candidates, and that this was really bad. So he has really severely angered a pretty large constituency, which is interesting. I actually do think it's a bad precedent to keep having military officers less than 7 years getting confirmed for the Department of Defense, regardless of who they are, regardless of their identity. I think it's a bad precedent. But I think he'll get confirmed precisely because the people who would oppose him are Republicans, and Republicans don't tend to oppose military officers. So I think it'll go through, and I actually think it's bad not on the basis of him. He's a wonderful person. He's a wonderful candidate, but I think the precedent is actually very destructive for the separation of civil military relations in the country.
We've always thought that it's a really important thing to have a civilian at the head of the Department of Defense. So I agree with you about that. I do think he'll be confirmed. It's a really big deal to vote against a nomination by a president of your own party, particularly an incoming president and one of the most prominent members of his cabinet. I don't think that'll happen. Okay. I think we're.
Professor Collins has to be in on the predictions too.
Oh, I think
Yes.
Murkowski actually stays identified as a Republican. It makes me think about Jeff Flake, who feels like he was pushed out of politics entirely because in any type of gesture that he seemed to make towards moderation, towards across the aisle stuff, he was getting death threats. And so I think it's just too costly right now to be a quote unquote nonpartisan or independent, especially if you're leaning Republican. So I think Murkowski actually stays Republican. And then I do think Lloyd Austin gets confirmed. It's historic. And I think you think about, the implications of the coalition that Biden was elected under, as well as how there's so much pressure right now under Congress to just like create stability. And I think a huge infight around the first African-American Secretary of Defense would just create a public battle that the institution wouldn't want to undergo.
As Wendy said, Murkowski did win re-election as a write-in independent candidate. It was really one of the most brilliant campaigns, very difficult to win as a write-in. Alaska has a law which says that when you write in a candidate, their name has to be spelled precisely correctly or the vote doesn't count. And when your name is Murkowski, that's a problem. So she ran a lot of sort of spelling bee kind of ads. And then on election day, they handed out these, rubber wristbands that for various fundraising sorts of things. They handed them out. They said Murkowski on them so that people could wear them into the voting booth and consult their wrist to see how to spell the name correctly. So on that note, we've really run out of time. We've run over, but I want to thank you. I want to thank you all so much, Carrie and Rose and Jonathan, Wendy. It's really been a really great conversation, and I wish we could go on for another couple of hours, but we're out of time. So thank you all, and
Thank you.
thanks to the audience for putting up with us.